Hello Kindred Longevity Lifestyle Designers, this is Govin here with secretsoflongevity.com. Have you ever been so engrossed by a movie that it keeps coming up in your thoughts in the way that you reflect on a subject that might be completely far removed from the movie itself, and you just keep getting reminders in your day-to-day life that makes you want to go back and keep watching it over and over again? There's, for me personally, not many movies that do this, but I guess if I were to categorize all the top movies that I've watched, and I'm not an obsessive movie watcher, but I do regularly watch movies, and there's definitely like top 5, top 10, which I've watched more than once. And while this movie is not my top most favorite movies I've ever seen, but it is up there, and I watched it again recently, and obviously watched it to prepare this review of it, but I wanted to take a different angle of it in terms of what I'm going to talk about within it, because there's the obvious story that goes along with it that anyone who watches it will see and empathize with, but there's the subtext that I got from it that is a lot of what I kind of kept thinking about in regards to it, and that's why I was drawn to go back to it. It was almost like a great example, for me at least, of a number of qualities that are admirable to have within oneself, and specifically if you have any kind of entrepreneurial interests or desires, or you're drawn to having the freedom of building your own business, or you build many businesses, or you just do anything that requires that sort of jack of all trades type of skills that is required to be successful in life. And in my opinion, that's what is displayed by the character Oskar Schindler in Schindler's List. Now you might think, if you haven't seen the movie, you might definitely think, well, that's a movie about World War II and the Nazis, and as far as most people know, he was taking advantage of the Jewish workers. And if you haven't seen the movie, I'd highly recommend watching it. It's directed by Steven Spielberg, based on the book by Thomas Keneally, and I will say it is only based on true events. It's not, at least from what I could tell from the movie, from my interest in World War II and some historical facts around it, there's definitely some things in the movie that were a bit silly in the way they were depicted, exaggerations, etc. But it's part of creating the effect of what was going on at the time. But the book that Thomas Keneally wrote was a fiction, but based on the stories and the related stories from people that were saved by Oskar Schindler through being in his factory. But there were some embellishments and definitely some things that were outright made up, and those are in the movie as well. And if you're interested in that, you can always go and look up people's critiques of it and how it was kind of displayed as this accurate historical picture when it was more of a drama and there was a theatrical element. But I'm not here to discuss that. But that is interesting if you're interested in that. And there are still, of course, many valid facts surrounding this figure, Oskar Schindler, and he was a businessman. He did go on to be a businessman through his life, even though his wealth dwindled actually throughout his life. And apparently by the end he wasn't well off in the slightest. But he was commemorated for what he did, and he was heroic in that regard, I'd say. And I think that was captured in the movie, and it's a very moving movie. It's really well shot in almost every way. I was just very much enamored with the romanticized side of it. I mean, obviously not the half of the images, which it kind of obviously follows multiple stories, but the qualities that were displayed by Oskar Schindler were kind of reminded me of why I liked the movie Gone with the Wind so much. So I have a fascination with, there's certain characters that just kind of do it for me, and is what I get enamored with a movie by. So much so that if you followed me on any social media, you might have seen that I create vines, and I've done some lip syncs to certain scenes from the movie, but the camera's on me from my phone, so I'm pretending to be Oskar Schindler, and I'll splice in some of those clips that I've chosen to use that just seemed fitting when I'm going to be referencing a part of the movie, and that you can kind of get the idea of that, as opposed to just splicing in actual scenes from the movie, which would put my video at risk of getting taken down or the monetization disabled or something. So I definitely want to reiterate that I am doing this review from the perspective of what lessons we can learn from business and capitalism and politics, and I'm not trying to undermine the very heart-crushing hardships that the Jews experienced and endured through the Holocaust, and especially in the context of the movie. That in and of itself makes for a great movie and is important for people to understand. But what I'm wanting to describe is how the juxtaposition between having someone who is from a free market mindset becoming entrepreneurial, coming into the dynamic of occupied Poland, just as that was happening, and you can see the change he goes through where he basically becomes more empathetic. And he still has the entrepreneurial mindset, but he has a different purpose by the end of the movie than what he had gone into it doing. He was obviously taking advantage of the free labor, or nearly free, very cheap slave labor of having the Jews in camps that were working in his factory, but it was through having a separate mindset that he was surrounded by the Nazi party and Nazi officers and soldiers who are just completely sucked into that hive mind mentality of statism, of socialism essentially, and he's able to operate outside of it. He works with it because he's obviously providing a service that's being sold to the military, but he, because he operates outside of it, what I'm arguing is that he might have come into it with this mindset, but he was able to develop and have his empathy and humanity actually be intact and rise up and encourage him to do the things that he did. So before I get further into it, I also just want to say there's obviously going to be some spoilers here. The big spoiler is obviously the story and its historical fact of what occurred, so if you have the slightest idea of what the movie's about, you already know the ending. But as I go through, I'm going to avoid describing really specific plot events, but you're going to hear some of them. So if you haven't seen the movie, maybe check it out before going further in this video. So after some of the opening of the movie, the first time we really see Oskar Schindler is him getting ready to go out once he's just arrived in Poland, and he's going out to dinner at I guess it's a club or a classy after hours dining kind of area. And you see him getting ready, and he's putting on the cufflinks, attaching the Nazi Party pin, and doing the things he does to be presentable. He stands out in the crowd of obviously mostly military garb, but everything from the way he moves, the way he talks, to the way he looks at people, he's got this class and this magnetism and this mysterious allure that I think embodies what obviously he's trying to do. He's doing this all on purpose because he's trying to win the favor and standing in the eyes of the SS officers and people around him who he's going to try and do business with. But he's at a social event, he's trying to network, make connections, and if you have any interest in doing that in your own life, that's a really valuable lesson to see and see it in action. I think that was done very purposely, and just that whole scene really sets the tone and mood for the movie. And introducing him, it's the song that's playing is Por una Cabeza, which was a hit song that was out literally right before the war, so it is perfectly for that time period. It was by an Argentinian musician who died not too long after putting out that hit song.
How are you doing? Leave a woman alone at the table in a place like this? Sweetheart, you're the picture of loneliness.
And then as scenes progress, we see elements of him just starting to get things together. He needs some more clothing. He ends up going to the black market to procure certain items he needs, more clothing, fashionable clothing that is made by Jewish tailors who were already under oppression, so he had to go to Jews on the streets that were hiding in a Catholic church, of all places, to find them and get them to sell him something, because it wouldn't be possible, since they weren't allowed at that point to even exchange money and do their businesses anymore, and they were very shortly going to be rounded up and put into the ghettos in Krakow. And then he's getting food and imported goods all through the black market. So it's this willingness to even under the heel of the Nazi regime as it's coming in and taking hold of this city and this whole country. And he's a member of the party himself, but he's willing to do what it takes to get his ideas in motion. And black markets come about when there's stiflement of the free market. So you look at what's available in the black market, it's available because governments try to suppress certain areas of people's voluntary interactions. So whether it's drugs, whether in that case it's imported goods and clothing and other things made by people who are being oppressed in that situation. So a lot of these things, whether they're vices or not, these are things that happen just normally through interaction between people. If they're not aggressive things directed at other people, theft, rape, assault, murder, anything else should be free reign for people to voluntarily do. If two parties agree to do something and exchange value for value, that's perfectly acceptable, and there's nothing immoral about that, except that maybe that thing is harmful to oneself, but that's one's own choice. So throughout the whole movie, there's actually many references to doing things through the black market, and he actually encourages the people around him to do things this way. Another instance is the way he gets the money to start up and buy a factory that had just closed down, because he didn't have a lot of money. He had, I guess, the remnants of a past business, which he had his nice clothing and allure and social skills from, but he needed funds, basically investment, to get his business started, and the people who had money, they still had their money at this point, were the Jewish people who were just beginning to be categorized and brought into the camps. And he basically came up with this plan to offer that if they gave him enough money to buy the factory, then these families, these investors, would get some of the pots and pans he was going to be making for the military, and they'd be able to trade those on the black market in the ghetto.
Money still money. No, it is not. Trade goods, that's the only currency that'll be worth anything.
And they didn't have much choice, because very soon their money would be worthless. It would probably even be taken from them. And he just convinced them that that was the best option, given the circumstances. It was him getting immense value for very little. And you can say that's exploitation, but if you wait to the end of the movie, you can see how it actually turns out for the best. Even had he not taken all those people in, just the fact that he had a factory through this whole time period, he was actually giving people shelter from the camp in Krakow, which was harsher than the people who were working during the day, at least, in the factory. They were much less likely to get shot on the spot from some random infraction that they were doing in the camp that was just outside of town. There's little things that Spielberg demonstrated, whether intentionally or not, like I've been mentioning, but another one was the way that a statist organization or government, if they're oppressing a certain group of people, they'll work to turn certain people within that group against themselves or against their people to better control them. So you're paying people to do dirty work that you would otherwise be paying someone else to do, but in the end you're going to be disposing of everyone altogether. It kind of makes you think about the police today and what you see, especially right now going on in Ferguson. These people are oppressing their own people. And in that case it was Jews oppressing Jews, but they were convinced and basically bribed to do that, which is awful, but that's the way this kind of statist mentality works. There's one scene in particular where he's chosen Itzhak Stern to be his accountant, because he was already the accountant for the factory before it was shut down, and he'd been rounded up, but he wants to get him back to work for him. And Oskar Schindler has this shrewd, very intense business mentality, almost predatory in the way he's very poignant in what he says, and he almost acts as if Itzhak shouldn't be shocked by what he's hearing. When he says, why don't you hire Polish workers instead of the Jews? They'll cost more, but they'll actually be getting the money. He's basically trying to say that his people will be working for Oskar and not getting anything, but little does he know that they're going to be forced to work anyways, whether in the camp, on something random, or in his factory, and that the factory will end up being a haven. But he doesn't know that at the time, so he thinks he's trying to convince him not to pursue the factory, but Oscar's very driven. And you might see that as a very negative thing, But if this was a case of there being no state and there was just people who needed work, he might be offering a very low wage, but if there's better work out there, they're going to take that. If he has a low wage, but it's all they can get, they're going to take that.
If you want, you could run the company for me.
What, if you don't mind my asking, would you do it?
I'd see that it had a certain panache.
There's a scene not too far in where there's a worker that Itzhak had obviously gotten to work in the factory against Oscar's description of what he wanted as workers in his factory. It's a one-armed Jewish worker, and he comes up to thank Oscar personally, and Oscar is quite annoyed and very irritated, actually, that this guy's working his factory when he's only got one arm, can only do so much work, and he's paying obviously the same rate for him for other Jews who are all being loaned out from the camp. He has to pay 5 Reichmarks per day for each worker, essentially. And that goes right to the Nazis, not to them individually. So the very next scene after that is an occurrence where, for whatever reason that day, all his workers got stopped and they had to shovel snow instead of going to his factory, because there's a traveling time between 2 places from the camp to the factory. And in the midst of that, the guy with one arm is trying to shovel, and he gets shot and killed because he's obviously not productive enough for the soldiers' liking. And the very next day, Oscar is complaining to the head officer, and he's furious that, and actually defending the fact that this guy was good at what he did in the factory, even though the previous day he had been irritated by the fact that he was in his factory. But you can start to see this empathy starting to come through already in the movie. The real turning point in the movie, where you see Oscar flip from being, a member of the Nazi party that's coming in and taking advantage of these workers, is when he sees the liquidation of the ghettos. And from that point on, you really see him as more of someone who's still doing what he's doing, running this factory, but he does not identify fully at all with all the Nazi mentality that is amongst the statist people and the soldiers, officers, etc. And he increasingly grows more empathetic and compassionate towards his workers, and is very possessive over them. He doesn't want them ending up anywhere and getting shipped off to the death camps that are further in towards Central Europe. But he maintains this polite air, and what I found very interesting about this was how he maintained what one would call good business acumen, or the ability to, it's essentially is that polite, because politeness, it's a mannerism, but it can also, if done properly and well, it hides your underlying feelings. And you see little snippets of him, his slight now hostility or hostile perception of the people around him. It comes out in little ways. So in one meeting, he kind of sarcastically remarks about how the tailor of his suit, after being asked about where he got his suit from by Amon Goeth, who's played by Ralph Fiennes, who's admiring it, saying it looks like a very nice suit, and the shirt has a nice sheen, and he says, well, he's probably dead now, and he has this look in his eye, just like, it's all your fault, you could have had a great suit, but you know what, you Nazis ended up killing him, and he was a perfectly good tailor off somewhere in the city that would have been rounded up and shot had he not been productive enough.
Where did you get a suit like that? There's a nice sheen about it.
Thank you. I'd say I'd get you one, but the man who made it is probably dead.
And then the dynamic between him and Amon Goeth through the movie, as it progresses, this is the first time he met him. Right from the get-go, Amon clearly admires Oscar. Perhaps it's his freedom as a businessman and his entrepreneurial skills, his allure, and his personality is obviously very attractive as a image of someone who's successful. And I think this is actually just a reflection of when someone is in that herd mentality. They're surrounded by people all the time who have that status bootlicking mentality. When someone stands out and is sovereign, they're going to have an attractive quality about them because they're free, and freedom, even on a mental, spiritual, emotional level, however free it is manifested physically, that is an attractive thing that people gravitate towards and are inspired by. There's a moment where Oscar, hears a rumor that his factory is starting to get known by the people in the town and the city, and also the Jews in the camp, that it's a haven, and people who work there don't get killed because he is very possessive of them, and that's starting to attract attention. And as soon as he hears that rumor, he reacts very harshly because he knows that if he's found out, he's in trouble. If there's any intention on his part of trying to harbor and protect Jews, it's going to look very bad on him. So he's very harsh and strongly spoken with someone who is trying to ask that he take in her parents. She was a Jew and hiding in the city. Her parents were in the camp, and he ends up actually taking them in the end. And that, obviously, he has to have that reaction to try and dispel these rumors, but he ends up taking these people in because he just feels so much for them. One of the most remarkable scenes, or several scenes, is one night there's some dialogue between Ammon and Oscar. Their friendship has increased, and Oscar appreciates him too. He finds his dark side where he's basically sniping Jews from his in the camp from his house on the patio on the roof. And Oscar finds that horrendous, but he's still friends with him anyways. And they're having this in-depth discussion about power and these different qualities that Ammon obviously admires and strives for, but he sees that Oscar has more of it in him himself. And his example is like, he's sitting there drunk and kind of sloppy, while Oscar had been drinking all night, but nowhere near as much, so he's admiring that as a way of controlling oneself, because that's real power, is to have self-control over oneself. And that obviously is displayed outwardly towards the people around you and through your business life and work. And there's a moment here where Oscar's talking, and the way he draws Ammon in, if you know anything about this, it's almost certainly, and not intentionally, it's just his mannerisms and his way of speaking. He's neuro-linguistically programming Ammon to not be as cruel, not be as harsh. And he's talking about real power isn't murdering recklessly the people that are under you or that you have control of, but is to have some qualities that are benevolent.
Power is when we have every justification to kill, and we don't.
I think you are drunk.
And this, if anything, actually confuses those under you, but what Oscar's trying to do is to have him, back off just how absolutely sadistic and sociopathic this character is. And it actually starts to show up in later scenes. He starts pardoning people, and you can see him reflecting and thinking about it as he does this. Someone's done something which he would have normally shot them for, and he lets them go. And then there's some scenes where he goes back to it, but later on, once again, he starts being a little bit more benevolent at times. And you can only help but think, this is the power and influence of someone who has this free mind and who is basically in the lion's den as someone who is free and operates through the free market and actually has some remnants of a conscience left in him. And he's, affecting those around him. He's sending waves through the ranks, so to speak. And as things start to wind up and it's getting closer to the end of the war, Oscar is increasingly compassionate. He's very, very friendly, and that comes back to causing problems in that he gets arrested. And without giving away too much, he obviously comes through on that, and it winds up to the end where he really realizes the extent of what's happening, what the Nazis are doing, shipping everyone off to Auschwitz. And he gets his factory to move locations to much further away, because that camp that they were at was going to be shut down and all the Jews were going to be shipped there. And he gets to obviously take his Jews that were already working in the factory, 1,200 or more of them, to this new location, and they end up surviving. And that's absolutely remarkable. So it's a very good movie in my opinion, despite the fact that you have to acknowledge that it's very theatrical. And if you want to look up the historical inaccuracies, you can. But I think it still has a lot of lessons that can be taken from this. And it's just very key to understand that in times of mounting statism, mounting absolute tyranny, which clearly was happening in World War II, it's happened before, it's happened in other locations at the same time, but also post-World War II. And we always see the same things that are going on there with the way the police and military work. And if you show any compassion to people when you're in those situations, you can very easily and very quickly be taken out as someone that's trying to work against the regime. Yet, if you have power and influence that you've accrued and built up through the free market, through enterprise, through business, you actually have some elbow room to make a difference when that's happening. So if we were to think about today, there's obviously tyranny in various pockets in the world. It's very much arguable that there's tyranny in the West that's mounting. Anyone that can't see that, I'd question your sources for media at this time. It's been quite a while since martial law has been enacted in the US, and that's happening right now. And how can you, as an individual with, low or middle income, actually affect and help the world right now? There's not a huge amount of way you can do it. Through the free market, you're actually providing services, as long as you're not going through cronyism, which is using the government to enforce your business to create a product or service that is actually detracting from people's health and well-being and abundance. But when you provide something purely through the free market that brings a lot of value to the table, whether it's some revolutionary new Bitcoin wallet that allows people to transfer Bitcoins more anonymously, or whether you're inventing some new technology that makes some environmentally hazardous technology from the past more or less obsolete. These are all things that come about through innovation and entrepreneurial work as free market as possible that really shifts things for the better and is a way of fighting tyranny, is a way of fighting the immense evil that so often you hear people summing up as being Nazi-like. It's the age-old degradation of any argument is when one side starts calling the other one, or at least their views, Nazi-like in nature. That's the end of the discussion, that at least any constructive discussion usually. But when we look to that, we can obviously understand that the Nazis were horrific. Arguably not as horrific as certain other regimes, but horrific enough that probably the most horrific in Western, European, and North American awareness in terms of having directly experienced it, and there being people alive in our culture that did experience it. So we need to take that as a lesson for where we choose to go in life and what we choose to do and how we can best serve the world and the people around us. So let me know what you think about this review of this movie. Definitely check out the movie. And with that, I'll talk to you next time. Take care and embrace life without limits.